have come to a pretty important time in our church year. And it's also an interesting time for a congregation as it breaks open the bread of the Word, because over this next set of about 4 or 5 weeks up until Ash Wednesday, we will hear snippets of Sermon on the Mount, which is 2 chapters from Matthew's Gospel, in which we hear some pretty fundamental lessons about what it means to be a follower of Christ. We'll hear things like, you are the salt and light of the earth. We'll hear things like, love your enemy as yourself. Or if you know somebody who needs your clothes, not only give your cloak, but also your undershirt as well. These are things that are all prepared for us in coming weeks, but more importantly, they're framed by what we hear this morning. The Beatitudes are an important part of Scripture for us. And what's really, really interesting is that, with the sole exception of the conversations between Jesus and John the Baptist, and then Jesus and the devil with the temptations in chapter 4, which we'll read when we do get to Lent, the first words of Jesus' public ministry are these Beatitudes, these words of blessing to people. I think that in order for us to understand and appreciate this fully, we have to recognize 2 things. One is that traditionally, the church has taken the Beatitudes as words of comfort and words of solace. And that's good and helpful and pastoral. But I think that given the context of the passage of Scripture itself, the words of comfort and solace can also be words of challenge for us. They can be words of challenge because the people who are being blessed are not the people that we expect. And it's certainly, in the larger story of Matthew, something that the readers of his Gospel, the interpreters of his Gospel, did not fully grasp at the start either. Right? Because we've made this natural progression. See, with Matthew, unlike the other Gospel writers, with Matthew it's abundantly clear who Jesus is, who Jesus is supposed to be. Right from the very beginning, we get the infancy narrative, which says that Jesus is descended from David's line, so he's the king of Israel. We get the information that shepherds and kings from the Far East have come to worship him, so he is recognized as a king. And also, he is recognized by the angels, and in what they sing from the heavens, he is recognized as the Messiah. All of these in the first 2 chapters of Matthew, and which we celebrated not so long ago. These roles of Jesus, these parts of who Jesus are fundamental to Matthew's audience, which is primarily Jewish, but also has some Gentiles within the fold. It's a primarily Jewish audience, so this conversation about Jesus as King, Jesus as Messiah, Jesus as the one who has come, it's a familiar riff off of a very important theme. And where that gets thrown for a loop is when Jesus is baptized, which we celebrated again a few weeks ago, in which Jesus is acclaimed not only as king, not only as Messiah, not only as prophet, but also, this is my son, with whom I am well pleased. This notion of kinship with God is a foreign one to a Jewish audience. Certainly one can be adopted by God, blessed by God, chosen as a nation by God, but certainly to have kinship with God, to be a son, is a totally different thing. It's a totally foreign idea. And so even in this Gospel of Matthew, in which we are told exactly who Jesus is and who he's supposed to be here for, it comes with some unfamiliar and uncomfortable territory, at least for the Jewish audience. The question of who Jesus comes for is also an interesting one. We know he's the king. We know he's the Messiah. We know he's the prophet. Matthew has told us this much. But who has he come for? He hasn't come for the rich and the powerful. He hasn't come for the scribes and the Pharisees. He comes for the poor, for the hungry, for the meek, and pronounces blessing upon them. I think that sometimes we lose sight of how radical these words are, because we forget that in the ancient world, if you had a physical deformity, or a family relationship, or any kind of mental or emotional instability that could jeopardize the community, you were automatically put outside of the community to protect the community, to keep it from being thrown into chaos. And so just before the Sermon on the Mount, we're told that Jesus is going through the countryside, hanging out with lepers, with people who are blind, people who are lame, people who are possessed by demons, whatever that means. But it's very clear that Jesus is not with the people he's supposed to be with. Right? He's operating outside of the community. And so, when Jesus goes to the top of the mountain and says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven," can you imagine the look of shock on the people that would faithfully go to the temple? That would be considered parts of the community as a whole. That would be considered, observant followers of the Torah. And to say that not them, but the poor in spirit, those who mourn, those who are meek, those who are weak, those are the people who are blessed. It's very interesting. I wonder that then, if we're to interpret the scripture given the context from which Jesus is preaching, what does that mean for us? Who are the poor in spirit in our midst? Who are those who are hungry and thirsty, whether it's for righteousness or for other things? I mean, one of the other things that I have to mention is that in Luke's rendition of the same sermon, there is no qualifier, right? He just says, "Blessed are the poor, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the hungry, for they shall be fed, and theirs is the kingdom." There's no qualifier, and it's only in Matthew. So, we think about it both in terms of the poor in spirit, but also the poor in the material sense. Who are those people in our midst? And I would want to suggest to you that the challenge of today's words is to recognize those who are blessed, those who are weak, those who are hungry, those who are poor in spirit. Those are the ones in our midst that need our attention, that need our love, that need our support, so that we can in turn be blessed by them who Christ blessed first. There is a tendency, I think, in the Christian tradition, to help out the poor out of charity, right? Because it's something that we must do, something that we are called to. I would like to suggest that it's something deeper than that. I would suggest that what we are called to is not only charity, but also solidarity. And so, what does it mean for us to be with those who are blessed, those who are poor, those who are hungry? It means to actually sit with them. Not to tell them that things will get better, although they may. Not to say that we're here to help, but simply to be, to sit, to listen, and to be blessed. I don't know about you, but sometimes, even in my role as a street pastor at Cronin, that's really uncomfortable. It's not something that we're used to, especially if it's somebody that comes from a completely different side of the spectrum, where we are either theologically or socioeconomically. It doesn't really matter, because we are the same. In our call from Jesus, we are both rich and poor, blessed and not so blessed, although we'll hear later on that Jesus says that the rain falls on the just and the unjust, the righteous and the unrighteous, the blessed and the not so blessed. We are all part of the same creation that God has made to be good, that God has made to bless and bestow blessing upon others. There is a real sense that we are called not to charity, but to solidarity. And so, one of the things that struck me as I was reading this is that there's the list of the Beatitudes, right? So there's, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, blessed are the hungry, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons and daughters of God. Those blessings, for me, as I was reading through, those are directed to those who are outcasts, those who traditionally are outside of the circle and can't find a way in. Whereas the last two, i.e., blessed are you who are persecuted and reviled, and who have all kinds of evil uttered against you for my sake, rejoice and be glad, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. I think those last two blessings are given to the church, are given to us. Because what happens when we sit with those who are poor and those who are hungry and those who are different from us, it can be really uncomfortable. It can lead to a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of people not realizing what we're doing and saying, why are you spending time with somebody who lives on the street? Why are you spending time with people who clearly have mental illnesses? Why are you spending time with people who clearly spend their money on drugs and alcohol? Although usually that's not the case. All of those kinds of actions on our part lead, or can lead, to ridicule, persecution, And depending on our personality, you know, sometimes that can be really embarrassing and really hard to live out. And yet, these Beatitudes are exactly what we're called to live. We are called to live in solidarity. We are called to live in grace and mercy and love with one another. Not because of who we are or what we do, but simply because God has blessed us first and is calling us to recognize who is being blessed, even if they're on the fringe of society, and to spend time with them, to be in relationship. I pray that as we move forward as a community in St. Jude's, we take the time to discern those words that begin the Sermon on the Mount. That we take the time to discern in our ministry together where we might be called to, who we are being called to spend time with. It is my hope and my faith that says God's love and mercy will guide us to do wonderful things. But first, we must heed the call. Say, yes, we will follow. Yes, we will be blessed. And in turn, we will bless others.